At one point, he was the golden child of hip-hop, the man behind chart-topping records, luxury fashion labels, and all-access celebrity lifestyles. Shawn Diddy Combs wasn't just a music mogul. He was an empire, but in a quiet Manhattan courtroom, all of that began to unravel. No paparazzi, no red carpet, no entourage. Just one man in handcuffs and a judge carrying a plain brown folder. No one expected what would happen next. It was early morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on cracked tile floors. Security was tighter than usual. 2 officers near the elevator whispered with visible tension. Even seasoned court clerks, people used to grim proceedings, sensed something different. The air wasn't just tense, it was heavy. At 2 p.m., Diddy was brought in. This time, not all of his children were present. Justin and Christian Combs sat in the gallery, legs bouncing, hands folded in quiet prayer. The others, Quincy, Delilah, Jesse, and Little Love, were noticeably absent. For the first time, the courtroom didn't feel like a stage. It felt like a reckoning. And then came Judge Kaplan. Kaplan entered the room gripping a tattered manila folder. No labels, no seals, just worn edges and hand-scrawled notes. One clerk would later describe it as looking radioactive. Another simply said, "It didn't belong in this world." What was inside that folder would shake not just the courtroom, but the very industry that had built Diddy's legacy. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a dismantling. Cassie Ventura, once known for her sultry vocals and collaborations with Diddy, had already filed a civil suit. But what no one expected was the raw, handwritten journal discovered in evidence archives. The words weren't polished, they weren't ghost-written, they were bleeding. She wrote about hidden corridors inside mansions, mirrored walls, music piped through walls until it distorted into whispers. She described rooms where you couldn't tell if people were dancing or being moved. Then came diagrams, crude sketches of rooms, symbols, and arrows labeled clinic, locked door, no exit. Her words weren't vague. Sometimes guests didn't remember signing contracts. Sometimes they never made it home. For months, Diddy denied everything. Then came the video. Security footage from a hotel hallway in 2016 showed Cassie, barefoot, wearing a hoodie, walking nervously down a corridor. Seconds later, Diddy appeared. Not enraged, not shouting, just following, like a man on rails. He struck her once, backhand. She stumbled. Another blow. She collapsed. No audio, but you could feel the violence. Even jurors gasped. A man in the gallery wiped his hands on his pants over and over. And Diddy, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. It was the moment public image died, and something darker took its place. After the footage, the prosecution revealed more. An exhibit cart rolled into the room, sealed plastic envelopes, receipts, medical forms. These weren't hospital records. They were from unnamed clinics, cash-only facilities. One entry read, "Emergency intervention, $15,000, no diagnosis, 3:47 a.m." The implication was chilling. Victims were being cleaned up, silently, professionally, before police or press ever found out. Witnesses confirmed the clinics were used after parties. No questions asked, no records shared. A clean slate for a price. Even defense attorneys began to panic. The morning before verdict, court staff were told to deliver a sealed envelope to Vault Room C, a part of the courthouse reserved for cases so sensitive, most people pretend it doesn't exist. Inside were 3 worn manila folders, guest lists, flight manifests, private event rosters. Some of the names were expected, figures already whispered about in dark corners of the industry, but others? They were shocking. Best-selling authors, motivational speakers, philanthropists, people known for family-friendly images. In the margin of one document, 2 initials, clearly recognizable, were hastily scribbled. Another name was partially scratched out, but still legible enough to guess. These weren't just people who knew Diddy. These were individuals who were there. Names that, if spoken aloud, could collapse entire media empires. And still, that wasn't the most disturbing part. Anti-trafficking analysts testified about the patterns of systemic abuse. They shared data showing 87% of organized abuse cases involved multiple high-profile individuals, people bound together by mutual blackmail, silence, and shared secrets. This wasn't about isolated incidents. This was a network where contracts were signed under influence, where young guests were told to just go along with it, where freedom was bartered in gated mansions and behind velvet ropes. It painted a picture of an elite ring of protection, where loyalty wasn't earned, but bought. The defense leaned into one final strategy. They claimed everything was consensual, that Diddy lived an alternative lifestyle, and his events were merely explorations of adult freedom. They called it the swinger lifestyle, defense. But prosecutors were ready. In a calm, clinical tone, they asked the witness, "Would you describe an environment where you're told when to enter, what substances to take, and who to interact with, under threat of harm, as consensual?" The witness paused, looked at Diddy, then looked away. No, not in any real sense. That moment changed the tone of the room. The courtroom wasn't debating morality anymore. It was confronting control. Then came a sealed bench conference, legal code for conversation the public isn't allowed to hear. It was supposed to last 5 minutes. It dragged on for 30. When the lawyers returned, they looked pale, like they'd seen something behind the curtain they couldn't unsee. One prosecutor's hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses. A defense attorney whispered furiously to her colleague, eyes darting toward the evidence pile. Word began to circulate in the gallery. There's someone more important than Diddy involved. Someone whose name hovered too close to the sealed documents. Someone the system might just bend to protect. In his closing remarks, Judge Kaplan didn't just address Diddy. He addressed the room, the system, the culture. Fame has become weaponized, he said. Loyalty has been bought like bloodless currency. Success doesn't erase violence. It doesn't bleach away the rot. You could have heard a pin drop. Even Diddy's attorneys stopped taking notes. They just sat in silence. And Diddy, he looked gone. Eyes blank, shoulders slumped, hands twitching against the cuffs of his designer jacket. There were no more headlines to write, no comeback tour to plan, no redemption arc in sight. The courtroom wasn't a stage anymore. It was a tomb. When the court emptied, a lone staffer noticed something lying near the bench. Another folder. This one wasn't marked sealed. It was marked archive, unsealed. It held records no one wanted to claim, memories no one wanted to face, realities the world had agreed to pretend were fiction. Because when history is scrubbed clean, when lawyers bury truths behind red tape, the only thing left is memory. And memory has a way of seeping into the cracks. You can buy silence. You can scrub the floors, but you can't clean what the world has already inhaled. The story of Diddy isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a collapse, a symbol of what happens when power is allowed to operate in the dark for too long, when industries protect their stars instead of their victims, when image replaces accountability. There won't be a Netflix special. There won't be a Grammy tribute. Just silence. Not the kind that comes from ignorance, the kind that follows truth. Because sometimes, the fall of an empire doesn't happen with a bang. It happens in a courtroom, one whisper at a time. As the court doors closed behind Judge Kaplan, the outside world exploded. News vans flooded the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted into microphones. The headlines came fast and unrelenting. Diddy surveillance footage revealed. Cassie's journal paints horrific picture. Court documents suggest A-list guest involvement. And then came the questions. From fans, from journalists, from people who had once danced to his records. How long had this been happening? Who else knew? Was this really the same man who preached about love, respect, and hustle? The illusion was shattered. Diddy wasn't just on trial for alleged crimes. He was being re-examined as a cultural figure. And suddenly, the glitter didn't shine the same. Behind the scenes, something more disturbing happened. Silence. Many of Diddy's peers, those who had once praised him publicly, vanished. Instagram feeds went dark. Brand collaborators issued no statements. Other music moguls dodged questions in interviews. It wasn't just fear, it was protection. The entertainment industry has always functioned on a code of silence. Power shields power. And when one giant falls, the others retreat into the shadows, hoping no one looks too closely at their own houses. Behind closed doors, damage control teams worked overtime. Attorneys redrafted contracts. Publicists crafted neutral statements. And high-profile executives quietly disconnected from the bad boy founder. But some relationships couldn't be erased. While Diddy sat in federal custody, it was his sons, Justin and Christian, who bore the weight of the public eye. They had grown up on MTV sets and red carpets. Now they sat in a courtroom gallery trying to hold composure. Witnesses noted their silent prayers before the hearing, their forced smiles when Diddy looked back and waved. It wasn't defiance, it was grief. They weren't just losing a father, they were watching their last name be dragged through the mud. A name that had once opened doors was now a liability. And in whispers around the courtroom, people began to ask, did they know anything? Were they used? Can they ever separate their future from his past? The sins of the father don't always stay buried. Diddy's career was built on ambition, spectacle, and reinvention. He was the man who turned champagne into a brand and nightclubs into empires. But somewhere along the way, access became ownership. And the court documents didn't just speak to violence or exploitation. They revealed something far more disturbing: a culture of entitlement, a system that enabled silence, an empire where power was the product and people were the price. This wasn't about one man's downfall. It was about how long we let him rise unchecked. Every award, every magazine cover, every talk show appearance. They weren't just success stories. They were chapters in a myth that said, if you're successful enough, you're untouchable, until you're not. Some verdicts are printed in court documents. Others are written in the minds of the public. As the trial moved forward, opinions split. Supporters claimed the system was trying to erase a black entrepreneur's legacy. Critics called it long overdue justice. Victims' advocates saw it as a moment of reckoning for the entire music industry. But most people? They were just stunned. Because Diddy wasn't just a celebrity. He was a cultural cornerstone. He had been there for house parties, prom playlists, and workout sessions. He wasn't supposed to be capable of this. And yet, the evidence kept stacking. The stories kept surfacing. The illusion kept breaking. And once memory cracks open, it never fully closes. There's a line in trauma research that says, when survivors are forced to rewrite their own history, they begin documenting everything. Not to remember, but so they aren't erased. That's what Cassie did. She documented, not for fame, not for revenge, but for proof. Because in a world built on image, truth has a short shelf life. And the more that came out in court, the clearer it became. This wasn't just entertainment, this was organized control. And for years, we called it lifestyle. For decades, the system didn't just tolerate Diddy's behavior, it rewarded it. Each time a whisper surfaced, it was drowned in platinum records and press releases. Civil suits vanished behind sealed settlements. Allegations were dismissed as rumors, and victims were often painted as bitter exes, disgruntled employees, or attention seekers. The courts didn't act. The industry didn't intervene. The public didn't question. Why? Because we're conditioned to protect power, to believe that success justifies behavior, to think that if someone brings in enough money or attention, they must be a good person. But silence isn't neutral. It's permission. And what happened inside courtroom 7B was the consequence of years of permission, stacked, sealed, and signed off by people who knew better. No empire is built alone. Behind every megastar is an infrastructure. Lawyers, managers, label heads, publicists, assistants, investors. Many of them had seen things, heard things, covered things up. Some had signed NDAs. Others had quietly moved on to new jobs. But the ripple effect of enabling abuse was always there, tucked just beneath the press photos and red carpets. We never saw anything. We had no idea. That wasn't our responsibility. These were the phrases echoed by insiders once the scandal broke. But Cassie's journal told another story. The surveillance footage said otherwise. The guest lists proved it. This wasn't a secret. It was an open pattern, camouflaged by wealth and charisma. Once upon a time, celebrities were gods. They weren't just admired, they were insulated. Diddy's image was carefully crafted. He was the underdog who beat the odds, the mogul who danced in his own videos, the genius behind Bad Boy, C-Rock, and Revolt TV. But behind the curtain, there were contracts signed under the influence. There were people who couldn't leave the party. There were bruises, journals, and sealed files. And when those truths surfaced, a myth died. This wasn't just the fall of Diddy. It was the death of the too-big-to-fail celebrity. The idea that fame was a shield, that charisma was a substitute for character, that powerful men couldn't be touched until the walls caved in. For years, the media played its role. Gossip blogs focused on Diddy's parties. Mainstream outlets ran feel-good interviews. Morning shows celebrated his business moves. Even when stories leaked, they were buried, dismissed as tabloid noise. But once the video dropped, everything changed. Suddenly, the coverage shifted from admiration to investigation, from photo ops to police records, from Diddy the icon to Diddy the defendant. It was a reminder. The media doesn't always expose. Sometimes it enables, until the story becomes too big to ignore. By the time they reported the truth, the damage had already been done. Cassie's journal was more than evidence. It was a mirror. It showed what survival looks like behind closed doors. It showed the cost of being disbelieved. showed the power of documentation. Her story, and those of other accusers, cracked open a world many refused to see. They weren't just survivors. Old songs feels eerie, because once the mask drops, everything looks different, even the past. This is what legacy looks like when truth arrives late. Not a polished biography, but a cracked mirror reflecting what was always there beneath the surface. It's easy to blame one man, to point and say, that's the villain. But the harder truth, we made it possible. The audience, the brands, the platforms, all of us in some way looked away. We praised the ambition. We envied the lifestyle. We called it controversial instead of concerning. And in doing so, we created a culture where abusers didn't need to hide. They just needed a good enough PR team. This wasn't just Diddy's downfall. It was a wake-up call for all of us. There's a line from Cassie's journal that no one can forget. You don't survive places like that. You just leave pieces behind until there's nothing left to take. That wasn't just a sentence. It was a truth millions recognized, because for every story that made it to court, there are thousands that never do. People whose trauma was dismissed, whose memories were buried under power and money. But memory is persistent. It leaks into the culture, it stains the narrative, and once it's out, it doesn't go back in. The verdict was never just about guilt. It was about truth, and whether the world still had room for it, something is shifting. In the past, scandals faded with time. Now they leave scars. Social media doesn't forget. Survivors are louder, and audiences are learning to ask the right questions. Accountability is no longer just a courtroom term. It's cultural, it's personal, it's expected, and as one empire crumbles, others are watching. Not because they care, but because they're wondering if they're next. The message is clear. You can silence a voice, but you can't kill a memory. And once enough memories surface, the silence breaks for good. At the end of the final hearing, someone stayed behind in the courtroom. Just watching, they described the dust catching in the afternoon sunlight, floating in beams through high windows, each particle a reminder that even silence leaves evidence. That courtroom, once a stage for excuses, now felt like a tomb for the lie we all believed in. Diddy didn't just fall, he dissolved. No team, no applause, no rewrite. Just a man who thought memory could be outrun, and a system that finally said, no more. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not even about one man. It's about a shift, a reckoning, a collective refusal to keep pretending. Because fame shouldn't be a shield, and silence shouldn't be the price of survival. In the end, this case wasn't just about what happened in private. It was about who we become when we finally stop ignoring the truth. And now, with the world watching, there are no more excuses, no more blind spots. Just one question. What kind of legacy do we allow from here on out?